Hello everyone and welcome back to Bitwig Studio and Music Production. This is lesson 3.52, and in this lesson we're going to take a look at Bitwig Studio's built-in compressor device. But before we do that, briefly one last word on the peak limiter, and I added this into the description for that video, but I also wanted to talk about it briefly. Now, I made a really silly mistake, and it's something that I shouldn't have done because I've talked about it already, and that's kind of underestimating any given device and just assuming that it's not going to work for certain tasks. The thing to remember about all of these devices and about every single plugin, every single piece of hardware, etc., is that they all have their own unique character. And for some reason, I really do like hearing whenever I apply any kind of effect. I like to hear a real obvious timbral change. And so before, when I was applying the peak limiter to this drum loop, we were really pushing it really hard beyond probably what you're ever going to be using this for. But at the same time, it came out sounding kind of new and really interesting and kind of had this weird saturation type effect that I really liked. And it was different from the L1, the L2, and the L3. The L2 and L3 are going to sound really, really clean, and they're going to be quite transparent. Where with this peak limiter, with these settings that we had for that drum loop, it gave it kind of a very new and fresh sound to it. So I just wanted to repeat again, never underestimate any one of these devices. Try them on anything. Sometimes they'll sound good, sometimes they won't. It all depends on the project. It's all about using these guys in context. All right, sidebar over. Let's talk about the compressor. Now, the truth is I don't use compressors very often, and the reason I don't use compressors is because, in essence, what they are dynamic controllers. Meaning what a compressor attempts to do is analyze the various levels of amplitude in a signal. So like in this example, we have these peaks, we have these louder transients, and then there are moments where it's quite tame and quite low. And the compressor is going to look at that, and it's going to try to level these out a little bit, or depending on how you program your compressor, you're going to be impacting the dynamic range in some kind of way, hopefully to make the sound better. Now, in Bitwig Studio, we have a little thing called our gain controller right here. And so if I zoom in, and for example, I'd prefer to bring up this opening hit. Let's take a listen to this really quick. Okay, so maybe I want to get that sustain of the cymbal to be a little bit louder. I can go in here to the gain. I'm going to wait for that kick drum to end. I'm going to have it fade up a little bit. Okay, and then as we get back here to this next hit, I'm going to drop it off really quick. Right back to its default. And I can even use the option control, and I can make a bend here. Okay, so let's take a listen to that now. Okay, so that's pretty audible. I don't really like that. Let's maybe make this a little bit different. Change these curve settings. And let's see what this sounds like now. Still pretty obvious. We've raised it quite a bit. Maybe we'll actually pull this out. Not raise it by so much. Now let's take a listen to it. Okay, maybe we want to bring up the level on this hi-hat here. I could zoom in. And what I'm really doing here is I'm kind of making moves that are quite similar to what the compressor is going to do. However, the compressor is going to be looking at the entire signal, where in this example, I'm just honing in on particular hits. So I could go here. Let's get this back to 0. Zoom it up a bit. And before our next hit, I'll bring it back down. So now let's take a listen to that. And then maybe I want to turn this hit down a little bit. Okay, so what have we done there? All we've really done is just added a little bit of dynamic interest into this rather static drum loop. And for all I know, this could have already been processed with a compressor. The cool thing about this is that we have so much control. We're not limited in the number of dots we want to make. If we wanted to make changes to every single one of these hits, we could do it. We can add curves with the option button. My point is just a compressor is making dynamic changes, but we can also make dynamic changes by just messing with this gain control here in any piece of audio. Okay, the reason why compressors were first developed, and really the original compressors were limiters, was back in the early days of radio. Now, from the very beginning, everybody knew that the one way to really make your station stand out from the rest was loudness. It wasn't really content, it was just if you're turning the dial and something comes in louder than something else, maybe you're going to be more prone to stick with that. And also, remember early on when it was just like AM radio waves, there was a lot of noise and there was a lot of inherent distortion and hum and all these other things that are going to make listening rather difficult. So one way to try to compensate for that is to try to increase the level at the source itself. So you wanted to record and you wanted to broadcast as hot as possible so that not only are you having the loudest signal, but you're also hopefully having the clearest signal. And although that's all well and good, there was one problem that would arise from this, and that was pushing levels too hot and running into hardware and running into transistors and into circuits and actually overheating them and having them break. And once they break, we're talking big, big money to go in and fix those. So back in the old days of original radio broadcasts and even in studios, you'd have a guy or you'd have the engineer with his hand on the fader, constantly trying to make these level adjustments, trying to push it as hot as possible without actually breaking anything. Now that's a pretty high stress job, and honestly, it's one that's kind of difficult to focus on for 2 or 3 hours at a time. So instead, what was developed for early radio stations was a limiter. And now what a limiter is, and I'm actually going to pull up the compressor here so I can show you. A limiter is just a compressor that has a really, really high ratio. Typically, we associate a limiter anything that's over 10 to 1. So once we start getting into this range, and even in this compressor, we can go all the way up to infinity, which is basically just a brick wall. And when I show you guys the dynamics device in the next video, we'll actually have a visualization of this, and you can see I can pull this all the way to infinity. And so you just have to imagine that once the signal crosses here, boom, it clamps down right away. That's really what limiting is, and so it is a little bit different from what we saw with the peak limiter, which is really designed to maximize loudness. So back to the story. So radio stations would get these limiters, get these compressors, and of course the first people to get a hold of those things were really the top dogs, because they could now broadcast really loud and they didn't have to worry about ever breaking their super expensive equipment. So let's fast forward to more of the present day, where of course we now have tons of digital technology, and I believe on radio stations there is some kind of regulations as to how loud you can broadcast. So they try to, control that a little bit, otherwise it would be absolutely ridiculous. And where you listen to the radio most of the time is in the car. And so if you're in the car with all that other background noise, of course cars have gone better, it's not quite as noisy in there. But you can imagine sometimes driving down a highway and just how loud, and if the road's not paved particularly well, there's tons of excess noise coming in. So the radio needs to make sure that everything is getting through and that you're able to hear at least somewhat clearly the music or the person talking. So they all use various types of limiters and compressors, but there are regulations. Now, in the actual music industry, with recorded music, with pop music especially, there are no real limitations on this. And so instead of it coming from the radio stations, you now have it coming out of the studio, where they really compress a lot of things. They really clamp down, because what it's doing is it's reducing dynamic range, which means you can bring the whole signal up. And when you bring the whole signal up, it has that perception, you have that sonic manifestation of it actually being quite a bit louder than it really is. And we've talked about perceived loudness quite a bit already in some of the earlier videos. Now in this video, we're going to walk through this basic compressor, how it's working, what it's actually doing, what these ratios mean, how to set attack and release, and I'm going to do maybe 3 different examples. We'll start with the drum loop. And one other thing I wanted to mention is that with any of these dynamic controllers, they come with presets. So here is Brick in Ya Face. Let's click that one. And you can see that now we have a super low threshold, a super high ratio, an attack, a really quick attack, and a relatively fast release with makeup gain and then additional output being added, which is kind of strange. But the thing I want to mention is that if I flip through these different presets, you'll notice how we have different threshold and ratio controls popping up. If you're like me, you're going to realize right away there's a serious problem with this, and that's there's no telling what your original signal level is to begin with. So always be hesitant of using any sort of preset on any of these dynamic controllers, whether it's a gate, whether it's a limiter, or a compressor. The reason being is there's no way that the preset can anticipate your actual signal that you're bringing in, how loud or how soft it is. So I always like to start from scratch and think before I actually start compressing, what is it I'm exactly trying to do? Okay, so let's just delete that compressor, bring in a new one. Let's listen to our sound and let's think about maybe how we want to control this. Okay, so I'm thinking those hi-hats are maybe a little bit low. If there was a lot of other stuff going on in this song, I'd want to be able to bring those out to make sure I could actually hear them, to make it really sound like it's all coming from one drum set and that the mics have all been relatively close mic'd. We want to just make this a little bit more cohesive. So what am I going to do? I'm going to turn this on and I'm going to start by setting a ratio control. Now, the way to think about it is like this. If my ratio is at 3:1, I wonder if I can actually type this in. I guess not. I'll just scroll it up. If my ratio is at 3:1, the way to think about this is that for every 3 decibels that passes this threshold control, only 1 will be allowed to pass. So that's why if we go to something like infinity to 1, it really takes on the Gandalf, you shall not pass, because every time something goes over, no extra decibels are getting through. It's just clamping down on it really, really hard. So if we had a 4:1 ratio, that's the same thing as 8:2, the same thing as 16:4. So if we were to pass something by 4 dBs, only 1 decibel is getting through. If we pass something by 8 dBs, 2 decibels are being let through. If we pass something by 16 decibels, 4 decibels are being let through. Same thing if we were going 10:1, 20:2, 30:3, etc. So I don't want to really kill this thing. I just want to gently nuance it just a little bit. So I'm going to pull my ratio to maybe, I don't know, 2, 3, something in that range. Let's go with 3 point, whatever that was, 3.5. All right. And right now my threshold is set to 0 dB, which means this is not going to have any kind of effect at all. You can see we're not seeing any blue, so we're not seeing any gain reduction. If I turn this on or off, absolutely no effect. As I start to pull my threshold down, we're starting to see a little bit of gain reduction. And right now you can see, watch this blue, especially if I turn the attack down. You can see the blue, the moments of compression are occurring on our transient hits. And you can even read the decibel readings here, and it does look like this is probably up around 10 or so dB. So let's pull this down a little bit more. And what the compressor is doing is it's actually turning down those moments where the sound is crossing the threshold. Okay? So it's not doing anything to the quieter parts. It's only affecting the louder parts. And you can see that with when the feedback and when we're getting some of that gain reduction here. Okay, now when I turn this on, listen to how the hi-hats are coming out a little bit more. Now, the one thing I don't like about that is that we're really clamping down on the kick really hard, and I'd still like the punch of the kick to come through. So how can I control that? Well, very simple. It's if like we were in here and we wanted to turn this area relatively down to wherever our hi-hat is occurring, but we don't want to affect that initial transient moment. What I can do is I can take my gain control and I can wait. Okay, so instead of letting it impact at this moment, I can pull it down from here. And so as you can see, my transient isn't really being affected, or it's not being affected as greatly as the rest of that hit. And that's really what our attack control is going to let us do. It sets how long it takes for the compressor to actually start kicking in. So let's take a listen to this as I pull this up. I'm going to just try to let that initial hit on the kick and on the snare through. So take a listen really closely. Listen to those attacks. Maybe a little more. Okay, I'm kind of liking that setting. And now the release is just like the release we looked at the peak limiter. Shorter release, it's going to be a little bouncier. Longer release, and we're going to have more of a average type level compression. So let's try to find something we like by just going to the extreme and then pulling back nice and slow. I'm going to try to keep this kind of bouncy. A little bit more. Okay, so we're getting some pretty good gain reduction there. And you're wondering, I thought that with compressors, it was all about making stuff louder. Well, of course you can do that. The trick to the compressor is that once you've turned down these peaks, we're able to turn the whole thing up. And right now, let's just go ahead and bounce this and see what it looks like. And you can see we've really tamed this thing. We've compressed it pretty hard. If we look at this original to this, you can see we're letting those peaks just through, but we're really doing some pretty heavy compression. And this means that now to the entire signal, I could just turn this whole thing up by quite a bit, right? And we're not going to be distorting at all. Compare that to if I go in here and I try to turn this up. Boom, I'm already hitting at the top pretty quickly. Right about when I'm starting to get into about 5 or 6 decibels of increase, we're already maxing out at the top. Compare that to down here, where if I pull this to, let's see, up to even about 14, we're able to actually go that much higher. And that's where compression gets its reputation for being able to be a lot louder, a lot punchier. So let's first apply what's called the makeup gain. And so the makeup gain is going to try to apply this gain automatically. I don't really like using this because when you use makeup gain, it always is going to make it sound like it's better because it's going to make it louder. But let's just listen to it, and sometimes it's just an easy go-to. So it's trying to match levels here, and it's done a pretty good job. Just from looking at the meters here, you can see that our transients aren't hitting quite as hard, but on average, this is going to sound louder. This is our before on the left and our after on the right. So let's turn this off. And now with the compression applied, we're going to start to really hear those hi-hats cutting through a little more. Let's go ahead and bounce this and see what it looks like. Okay, so, oops, I should not have had that on. Let's do that again. That's probably also why my settings sounded a little weird. Yeah, that really just gives that drum set a whole lot more oomph to it. Not that oomph is a technical term, but it's a good way of explaining this sound. So now let's bounce it pre-fader without that extra gain increase at the beginning, and we can take a look and see the difference here. Pull that up a little bit. Here's our original. And here's our compressed. All right, so you can see how it's attempted to match levels, and really all the stuff after the hit, after those initial transients, has been brought up to try to level out that particular drum loop there. Now, I typically don't use makeup gain, and what I end up doing is I manually set this myself. And to manually make output, or to make makeup gain, all you have to do is increase this output control, and it goes all the way up to 20 dB if you really want to push it. So let's quickly take a listen to this. And let's see if I go all the way up to something pretty high. Like I said, we could do like 14 or 15 without even going into the reds. That's a little too high. And we will bounce it one more time. We can see that we can really bring the level up quite hot and not actually have any clipping occur. Okay, oh, maybe we do a little bit there, so we've gone a little too cray-cray. Let's bounce it again, just to see. All right, and now we look pretty safe. Very cool. If I wanted to be able to compress this even harder, I'd pull the attack time way down. All right, so now we've lost the punch of that kick drum, but what we're now going to be able to do when we bounce this is we're going to see that when we zoom in on these transients, now suddenly have a whole lot more room to bring up the overall signal if we wanted. And so I could really crank that output and probably still be able to bounce it. And look at that, we're still not having any clipping occur, maybe just a tiny bit there. But we can listen to this now and it's going to sound huge in comparison. It always sounds even huger if you have two tracks playing at once. And then we could compare that to our original. Right, absolutely worlds of difference. And then of course, if we wanted to, we could also play with the ratio and absolutely slam this thing. This is what something super... This is an example of something that sounds super, super over compressed. Any dynamics that were in that original are completely gone and have been stripped away there. All right, so it's all about just kind of dialing in those right settings, finding what works for you, and being happy with it. Now, obviously, we could apply compression to absolutely everything, and in certain contexts, you're going to need to do that with some of your music. The one time I say go to compression is when you're making something and you're listening back to it and you're noticing, you know what, I'm losing it at certain points. Like I can't actually hear any clarity to that sound anymore. It's being masked, not necessarily by frequency, but just by other amplitude. And of course, the first things to try to do is to maybe use EQ, use panning. You can also do your own automation with either a slider or with the tool control. That would be my recommendation. But if all of those things fail, if saturation fails, which is a good alternative to compression, if even trying some delay and spatial effects fail, then you have to go in, you have to dive into the compressor, and then you have to try to even out those dynamics using that particular tool. The reason why people are very hesitant about using compressors is because there is the old stereotype that it crushes the life out of your music. To some degree, that's true, but in some music, that actually works quite well. Again, it's all about context. It's all about knowing what you're going for. And until you know what you're going for, I don't really see any reason to try to use a compressor. So let's do a couple more examples. We can use compressors on individual hits as well. So if we just delete this compressor, delete the drum loop, and let's pull up the snare hit here. Hopefully this will be a good example. Let's take a look at this snare and see what we can do with it. Play it back. Okay, so maybe I want to just add a little bit to the second half of that snare. Let's see what I can come up with here. So I always like to set my attack all the way to the bottom, my release all the way up to the top. Dial in my ratio. I'm going to go with maybe, let's go with something a little more aggressive. Let's go with like a 5 or 6 to 1. You can see the release setting is way too long. Let's give room for a little bit of punch. Actually, I'm going to keep my attack really low. That's good. Now I should be able to bring up the overall level of this thing. Let's just delete all these examples. The goal here is to try to match gain. A little more. So you can hear how much more boomy this sounds. It actually sounds a lot worse, but we can take a look at it, see what's happened. So here's what our original looks like. Okay, and here's our compressed version. Original and compressed. So we've really taken away the initial attack here and instead have really boosted up the sustain portion. Now, I would typically use the transient controller if I was going to be trying to do dynamics control on a single hit, but just be aware that you can use a compressor to do it if you want. Last but not least, let's talk about using a compressor on voice, because that is probably one of the most common and misunderstood applications of all. The reason why we have to use compressors on the voice a lot of times is because the voice is incredibly dynamic. If you were to look at some of the performances of top pop singers without a compressor and then with a compressor, you'd see just by looking at the waveform how much that compressor has to work to try to even it out. You want to make sure you can hear your vocalist all the way through, especially in something like pop music where the song is all about the vocalist. And in order to do that, oftentimes you need to use a compressor. So I'm going to do kind of a crazy example here, I think. And let's check our preferences and set the input to my built-in microphone. So I'm going to whisper something and then I'm going to say something. And then what we're going to try to do is even out those dynamics first by using like a tool device, and then we'll actually use the compressor. So input from this guy. Let's see if this is working. Do. It seems to be. Let's turn that off, set that up to record, and here we go. What was just playing, this guy? This is me whispering. This is me talking at a normal level. Okay, cool. So let's take a listen to that, see what it sounds like. I'm going to go back and turn this to no input. Lovely. Okay, here we go. This is me whispering. This is me talking at a normal level. Okay, so if we look at this real quick, you can see there's a big difference, and yeah, that all came off a little bit creepy, and I tried to talk really loud. But what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to level these guys out. If there was like strings or something playing in the background, or just any other music playing in the background, maybe we can put the drums here, and this will help make this make sense for you. Talking at a normal level. Okay, so one of the reasons why you can still hear my voice, and this is a great lesson about compression, is because compression and just in general with music and mixing, it's all about frequency spectrum. If you fill up your mix with things in like the 1 to 4K range where the human voice is typically located, then you're going to get a lot of frequency masking. Right now we have the drums, and the only thing that could really give us trouble with hearing my voice over the drums would be the cymbal, would be the hi-hat, and maybe, just maybe the snare if like we had the right kind of reverb on it. But right now that's not the case. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate this, delete these guys, and let's put on, I think we have the chord here somewhere. Yeah, that's great. Okay. So let's see if we can come up with a little bit of a better example. This is me talking at a normal level. This is me talking at a normal level. Okay, so here's a pretty good example. So with that chord in and with the chord going right down the center, which again, you probably wouldn't do, you would want to use panning in this situation to make the mix work, we're going to have to use compression on the voice. The first thing I could do if I didn't want to jump to a compressor right away is to actually jump in here and to change the gain manually. Okay, so we can see that there's a big difference here, right? Let's try to fix that up. That was a double click. Uh-oh. That was bizarre. Sometimes we get these really bizarre errors still. All right. So now that I have these two, I can bring both of these up if I want. Looks like I have to bring it up quite a bit to try to match the level. Eee. That's all a little crazy. We're just going to do this quickly. Okay, so that kind of needs to come down, doesn't it? Because that's really loud. I can bring it back up. Okay, so this is going to sound a little weird, but let's take a listen to this now. This is me whispering. This is me talking at a normal level. So now the irony to that whole thing is, even though I'm whispering, it sounds a lot louder. It sounds like I'm right in your ear whispering. And when I'm talking, I'm further away. This is why compression and all these things are really difficult and really tough concepts to explain. Because if you're going for realism, you want the whisper to be a little bit more quiet. Now, if we were ever able to balance out these gain levels perfectly, the whisper would actually still sound quieter to the listener. Why? Because we're used to a whisper being quieter than someone talking at a normal level, and we can pick up on those different timbres and instantly know. Now let's actually use a compressor. Let's get rid of all of these dots and drop a compressor on here. All right, here we go. Let's see if we can get this to work. Talking at a normal level. This is me whispering. This is me talking at a normal level. This is me whispering. This is me talking at a normal level. Okay, cool. So we've pretty much done what I wanted to do. I was able to compress it. And now if we take a look at this, this is me talking at a normal level. We should actually be able to see we're a little closer now. Not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. We could actually try to dial this in a little bit better if we wanted to, but I think you get the idea. And really, just from watching me kind of go through here and try to mess with the parameters, I hope you can see that compression is not just something that you use to try to add punch to a drum loop or to try to make something quote unquote cut through the mix. It doesn't always work like that, because imagine if every single thing on your project was compressed super heavy. It's the same thing as not doing any compression at all, because suddenly everything is cutting through, everything is punching through, and everything is back competing. So that's why if you are working on a really big track, add compression to some things, but not to everything. Perhaps just the most important thing that you really feel needs to get through there, and let other things play a supporting role, because that's what music is all about. It's a healthy balance in everything you do. Okay, so same thing with compression. I always advise people, unless you've experimented with compression for a long time, don't just start dropping it into all of your projects and thinking it's going to solve everything and make your music better, because quite frankly, it's not going to do that. It's a lot like getting your license. You need a good 10 or 15 hours of practice with a compressor before you get your license to use it and start dropping it into your tracks, because it's very easy to over compress things at the sake of it being louder without realizing that you're actually hurting your production as a whole. So I'm going to leave it at that. I hope that was somewhat helpful for you guys. Get in there, mess with this compressor, put it on everything, see how it changes the overall timbre, etc. We didn't even talk about different types of compressors, because in the case of Bitwig, we have this one kind of digital compressor. In the real world and in the plugin world, there are so many different types of compressors. A lot of that is because compressors were the first kind of studio equipment that was built, and so there's been a lot of time to develop and to use different technologies and different types of circuits to hopefully get different kinds of sounds. So if you are more interested in the topic of compression and compressors, plenty of places you can go to do research. And I think even in Logic's built-in compressor, if any of you use Logic, they have a bunch of different modes. They have an opto mode, they have an FET mode, they have a VCA mode, and then I think they have the platinum mode, which is their digital compressor. And so the compressor in here, with how it's set up, is going to probably sound most similar to the platinum mode in something like Logic. But do mess around with this, do have some fun, and if you're interested, do additional research. So thank you so much for watching, and you'll hear from me again in the next lesson. Take care.